So I've been thinking a lot about a partial perspective, just the name.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How do you interpret a partial perspective? Like, what's your thought process behind it? Because I feel like I have several, but like, if people
Well,
ask you why, what does it mean? What would you say?
I mean, for me, I feel like it's pretty simple and straightforward. Like, for me, it's just, we all look at the world differently, and, we all come at it with different perspectives, and it's hard because sometimes I don't know if one perspective is better than the other, or if one is right, or the other is wrong.
Yeah.
But I think just always going into something, wanting to learn someone else's perspective on an issue and being open minded, and but just really like taking the time to understand it, and you maybe even repeat it back to them to see if they feel understood. I think that's a big part of it, and I mean, just as simple as that, really.
It's very like clinical and therapy oriented in a way,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
but it makes sense. Um, yeah, because I think the more I think about it, like, what does a partial perspective mean? I mean,
Yeah.
for one, like you said, all, all perspectives are partial to some extent.
Right. Yeah, that's another big thing. Yep.
Yeah. So we're all sort of playing the game by our own narratives and our own formulation of what we think is going on. And then, yeah, perspective's huge. And we're based, like, our behaviors are based on our perspectives, and we are constantly changing our perspectives in subtle ways and maybe even in fundamental ways. And that ultimately changes our behaviors, and it changes maybe in the way that we think of ourselves.
Right.
So I feel like even though it's simple, and I'm sure, like you said, like you came at it with such like a simple, like, yeah, straightforward, everyone has their own perspective. I think it's interesting
Mm-hmm.
because it can be so much more profound depending on how you look at it, which I guess it's very meta because it's like your perspective is going to shift as well. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, we would hope that, with being open minded, that, maybe you come across someone or a discussion where you think, oh, well, maybe my perspective is in need of a change.
Yeah.
And, going into it open minded and saying, like, okay, well, like, yeah, maybe I can change my attitude towards this topic because, I've learned something new from someone else, or someone has, given me a different perspective on the issue.
Right.
So, yeah, it's that open mindedness. And then, like you said, like, it is partial. And I think it would be dangerous to keep a certain perspective of yours,
Mm-hmm.
like, permanently, or want it to last forever.
Yeah.
So it's just having that open mindedness of, like, okay, like, like, my perspective can change any day, or like if I learn something new about something.
Right.
Right. So I think that's important too.
How So how do you see psychology? Like, how would you define psychology to someone? Because I'm thinking about how we're, we're mainly coming from anthropology and psychology backgrounds. So I
Yeah.
guess, how do you feel like your, I don't know, how do you look at psychology? How do you view it in the world, in academia? I guess just broadly, how do you think you're approaching psychology coming to this channel and podcast?
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, like, personally, I come at it with just an open mind, like, and a curiosity to learn about how we think
Mm.
about certain topics, and, obviously, like, how we behave. But yeah, just the open-mindedness and just the curiosity to see, like, what's been changing, what has the research been saying.
Yeah.
um I'm just That's always been my curiosity about it. Like, I'm really interested in that, and and I don't think like one approach or one, psycho, or one theory is right over the other, and
Yeah.
like it's gonna be like that forever.
Yeah.
Like, there's always, theories are evolving, orientations are evolving, and because we're always learning, right? And that's what we would hope.
Yeah.
And adapting to new changes and new perspectives. So
I think it's funny that you said no one theory is going to be like, or it sounds like you're saying no one theory is going to be right for all times and that's it, like end of story.
right.
Because it reminds me of Jerry Moore, Dr.
Yeah.
Moore in Anthro department at SUDH. Because when I taught there last year, I asked him, what do you think about, like, the theories that you teach in your theories class? Like, if you had to choose one theory to go with, or if you, like, how do you view all of those theories? Like, which one do you think you ultimately go with when you're conducting research? And he told me, you go with basically whichever one fits. Like, you go with whichever one makes sense in the context. And I felt like two sides about that, because on the one hand, I feel like too often, at least in my undergrad, I found a lot of people clinging to a handful of theories. And I think for the most part, a lot of people do. And I'm sure it's the same thing in psychology. Like, people like certain theories and they're going to repeat that theory and stand behind it. And that's what they're all about. But
right.
the reason why I felt like, so on the one hand, I feel like, is it right? Was his answer right? Because it seemed very wishy-washy in a way. Because, like, okay, like, if you're not standing in the corner of something, like, what does that mean? Does it mean all theories are subjective? Like, I kind of took it in, I guess, almost like a postmodernist lens. But I think since then, I think I've understood that instead, going with whatever is right in the context makes it more complicated and I think more appropriate. Because I think all theories are correct in the right context. It's like when we try to apply it to everything else is when we start falling short. And when we start seeing where there are, like, drawbacks, where they might not fit. So since then, I feel like I've been able to see how theories all are valid in different ways because they all speak to some kind of truth. Like the video that we did on evolutionary theory, someone commented on it the other day, saying that they felt like it was right. And I couldn't say it was wrong because it's not wrong. Like, there's a fundamental truth to it, and it's that cultures change and cultures adapt. And cultures change because of the natural environment, because of interaction with other cultures. And because we call it evolution, the social sciences always look to, like, biology and the natural sciences to come up with concepts. And evolution is one of those. So because we call it evolution doesn't mean that it's necessarily biologically, like, evolutionary in the same way biological evolution is. I think it's just just speaking to a broader truth that cultures change and adapt. So yeah, I don't know. It was interesting to see how a lot of theories can fit in the right context. So I guess hearing you say what you said about psychology, I feel like that does ring true.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. If we go back to, like, when Freud was still alive, and, I think his theory was, I mean, I think there's still some truth even to this day of what he spoke about and what he believed. But also, too, like, some of the other stuff was kind of out there and weird. It's like, I mean, we would look at it, like, as outdated, right?
Yeah.
So I think, but we have to think about the context in which he worked in and the time period.
Yeah.
And I think maybe for that period, it did work and it did make sense. But then, as we moved along to Carl Jung and, we start adapting, we start improving upon theories from the past, and I think that's the best way to go about it.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're right. Like we have to take into account the context that we live in now and
Uh-huh.
what's going on in society, and yeah, and make the necessary changes on a theory
Mm-hmm.
or approach to fit the appropriate or the or just fit the yeah the what's going on, what's appropriate for the time,
Yeah.
you know. So
So I also heard you say how, because, in every intro to psychology class, you're going to learn about Freud, like he's like, he's the beginning point in psychology, like Franz Boas is in anthropology. Like they're the ones that
mm-hmm.
we credit to like establishing at least the trajectory that we now consider our intellectual tradition. So that's Freud, I think.
Right.
But it's also that we can't ignore Freud because ultimately I think he's still beneath the surface, even though at the end of every 100 level psychology class the professor is going to be like, well, he may have been a cokehead and he said all these
Mm-hmm.
wild things. He was probably projecting a little bit,
Yeah.
but he's still there and he's still looming. And I think that's the perfect kind of analogy for human life, culture, history, society. Like the past is always kind of there, even if we don't
Right.
necessarily see it anymore.
Right. Well, 'cause I think they discovered certain just very fundamental, you
Mm.
know, behavioral frameworks that are still present to this day.
Yeah.
And like yeah, I think there are certain things that the early forefathers discovered that still
Hmm.
there's still some truth to it even to this day.
Yeah.
But of course, like I said, like not everything, and I think we've done a pretty good job in, at least I can speak of in psychology, to improve upon the theories, and as we learn more about human behavior and the human mind, I think we've made some pretty good improvements and changes. So
And there's something to be said about the fact that a lot of these theorists were able to, I don't know, I guess observe the world in a way to extract some level of truth that we still look to, like
yeah,
100 years ago. Like it's been so long, they didn't have the statistical theory and methods that we have today. They didn't have a lot of the stuff that we
right,
have today,
correct.
but they were still able to make do. And I think, I think that's
Yeah.
very noteworthy for a lot of philosophers too, because
Mm-hmm.
I think the social sciences play with a lot of philosophy at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you're saying about evolving. Like, it's evolved in that sense where, yeah, our methodology has improved, or we've found better ways of doing certain things,
Yeah.
and yeah, in that sense, it has evolved. We implement those new improvements, and we try to do things better, and yeah,
Hmm. I have a question.
yeah,
Um, well, I guess before I ask the question, maybe we can use some of this to like come up with an intro to like our thought process behind a partial perspective. But
mm-hmm.
um, like I see anthropology, because anthropology prides itself in being holistic.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's an there's always blank anthropologists. So there are psychological anthropologists, and there have been for, I don't know, decades, if not almost 100 years, at least. There, um, you know, basically every single kind of anthropologist, and so I think that's interesting because you know Jordan Peterson talks about a lot about postmodernism, and in
Mm-hmm.
no discipline has that been most apparent, I think, than within anthropology, because for the most part, the sciences and the humanities, and I guess scientific realists and postmodernists have been able to be siloed, So it's like our modern like social media communication. We look at how people basically stick with their own people, and they like shout each other down with people they disagree with, and that's kind of it.
Right.
And I feel like that's how a lot of this conflict around like postmodernism constitutes itself, because you're able to basically, hide back in the turtle shell and just shout out whenever you want. But in anthropology, you share the discipline with people who may think completely differently from you. And I think there's a kind of strength in that, because now I think because of like budget cuts and the fact that universities don't want to pay for like separate departments, like a lot of anthropology departments, at least within the last 10 years, if not longer, have had to come back together, because 20 years ago they all like split apart, which
Right.
is hilarious. But I think anthropology, it's the fact that it can draw in so many diverse perspectives makes it really interesting. But where I think anthropologists go wrong is the fact that like I've heard a lot of interactions where, for example, like an anthropologist would be like, oh, psychology, they look at the world wrong and in this narrow reductionist way.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you could say that about anything, and I don't think that necessarily always contributes more to the conversation. But I think one of the interesting concepts in anthropology is the concept of culture.
Right.
And that's what I wanted to ask you about. How would
Mm-hmm.
you define culture?
Oh God. Well, I mean, when I think of culture, obviously I think of people in a group,
Yeah.
and it's how we interact, how we form, I guess, like the group beliefs,
Right.
how we formulate traditions, what kind of what roles individuals take, according to maybe like their gender or their age.
Right. So everyone fits into their culturally prescribed roles.
Right, exactly. Right. Like we formulate these roles that, keep getting passed down through generations, I feel, and yeah, that's the way I see it. And of course, I think culture does change, and I guess those are my initial thoughts right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because in anthropology, it's like, yes, culture is shared. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like passed on in generations, but also situated among people. Culture's learned. No one's born with culture. I mean, you're born into a culture, but like if you're not just going to have your culture once you're born. Like you have to learn it and develop those social roles and cues
Mm-hmm.
based on gender, based on all those things that we would, I guess, call identity. Like all of that is tied with how culture is playing on the individual.
Right.
And I think what's been most ironic is that culture in anthropology has become almost meaningless, in the sense that I think anthropologists have now understood that culture now becomes the way of differentiating people. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm in medical anthropology. So one of the best examples is the idea of cultural competency. So cultural competency is usually programs within hospitals and clinic settings where someone comes in and trains physicians and hospital staff on how to be culturally competent.
Mm-hmm.
So usually that means teaching people to say, oh, yes, other people's cultures are very important, and we should be very respectful of them. And culture is something that we have to be sensitive to.
Right, right.
But the issue with that is that then makes people assume that culture is the reason why people are different. Even though statistically, even people within the same culture are different. People differ. We differentiate from one another.
Right.
So that's one of the issues. Because one example that we have a physician in our PhD program right now, and he was talking about how, well, he teaches classes in the medical school at USF, and he was talking about how he was hearing like cultural competency, but also one of the pamphlets that they gave about different cultures. And one of the examples was how Muslim women typically want other women to examine them. And it was funny because he's like, well, every woman wants a woman to examine them. Like, that has nothing to do with her being Muslim. It's just the fact that that's what she's comfortable with. Because not every Muslim woman is going to want or demand that a woman examine them, because comfort's going to differ. So he was saying, like, you know, culture is something that, and this is something a lot of people in the program have said, that culture is something that you kind of have to just cast aside, because culture in that context isn't really going to be useful. If anything, it's just going to be people's justification for why people are different or being difficult in a clinic setting. So then we start blaming culture, and that's where it gets kind of problematic.
Yeah, well, who gets to decide those new cultural, or these new cultural standards?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, is it the Muslim women themselves? Sorry.
No, of course not. It's whoever. That's the thing. That's a good question. I don't know how they came up with that, because,
right.
Anthropologists have been complicit in that type of shit in the past.
Right.
And they still kind of are, because, again, like, people are different, and they differ. And some anthropologists would be completely comfortable being like, yes, Muslim women will be like that. But that doesn't, I mean, first of all, that ignores how these things change. So who knows? That could have been established 10 years ago, where it was maybe seen within a specific context. But then even that speaks to sampling. Who are the women that were gathered that made this generalization? So either way, it's bad and wrong, but I don't know. It's more wrong, the fact that people cling to it.
Right. And you're just speaking just in the medical setting, right?
Yeah, this is just a medical setting. Although, like, even a lot of public health classes talk about that. And public health isn't necessarily in the medical setting, but it plays off of the biomedical paradigms. And even, mainly, like, it tries to be like the social science arm of biomedicine. That's basically the best way to think about public health.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know that's happened quite a bit with psychotherapy too, where learning. This isn't new to psychotherapy, but it's, they have been teaching therapists or prospective therapists how to be more culturally competent, right? Depending on the type of client you have, like what their background is.
Right.
But I do think with therapy, I think it is more suitable to know the background of your client, because like, we have different experiences, as depending on where we grow up, and what culture we grow up in. And so it is important to know those factors, those backgrounds of people,
right,
to better aid them in in getting better, or whatever their goal is for therapy.
Yeah.
But that's interesting, because I've never heard that happen in a medical setting.
Yeah, it happens quite a bit. That's a big study. Like, this one anthropologist, Kiara Bridges, in New York hospitals, was talking about how like there's a lot of ways that we generalize culture to account for difference and justify why certain people are treated better or worse. In her study, it was about African American women in clinical settings who are also in low income settings. How in a teaching hospital there were a lot of people or a lot of physicians that were being trained, and they were learning this culture of difference and learning that black women's bodies were they could be treated more harshly, that they could that black women didn't feel as much pain, all of which are like false, like they're not true, but those were the things that they were learning. So yeah, race is pretty huge. And I mean other things, all those, like anywhere way you can differentiate and call people one culture versus another, like that exists in a lot of settings.
But where do those, I guess, stereotypes come from? How do they start? Do you have any idea?
I read last year Stamped from the Beginning. That book was by Ibram X. Kendi, and he was talking about how during slavery a lot of enslaved African women were basically like tested on, and like people tested actual like medical devices and treatments and procedures on black women, on their bodies. So
like new stuff that was coming out, right?
Yeah.
Or okay.
And even that has some, I guess, disagreements, because there's this one guy, like the father of gynecology, he without anesthesia did it on like 12 enslaved African women, and like I guess it was like, you know, vaginal procedures that were pretty invasive.
Right.
But I've heard other articles saying that no, well, I mean, it was a pretty not invasive surgery and he was nice to them. I really don't know. That was a fairly recent article, but
yeah.
At the same time, last year there was a nurse in our class, and she was talking about how it's basically sort of accepted that, I guess, white boys, babies tend to be quote unquote whiny, whereas black girls tend to like be very like tough. And as she said that, I was like, is no one going to call her out on that? Should I do that?
Yeah.
I didn't say shit, but no one else did either. But I was like, I don't know if she was saying that it was wrong, or the fact that or she was saying if it was a fact. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But I didn't say shit. It wasn't clear to me, and I'm like, looked around. No one said anything. I should have said something. I should have inquired more into that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sucks.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
I think it's confirmation bias in a lot of ways.
Right.
Because it happens and we notice it, that just reinforces it.
Right.
Who knows if it's true?
Exactly.
But there was another article that I read on Guatemala.
Yeah.
On a certain Mayan group, or in a certain location. It was talking about how they wanted to increase breastfeeding among Mayan women. And
increase it?
Yeah. They wanted to increase it to, I guess, as high as it could, but in their study they found it was about 70%.
Of the women?
Yeah.
That were doing it?
70% of Mayan women in that area were breastfeeding. And it said, I guess the part that bothered me was that they said that they wanted to increase it more. And, you know, there have been a lot of good advances in the past decades, but we're going to have to learn what cultural barriers are in place and be culturally relevant in order to increase those numbers. So the reason that bothered me is because, I mean, first of all, again, you're blaming culture for why women aren't breastfeeding. Second is that you're ignoring that a lot of Mayan women, especially now, are having to enter the workforce, which makes them not be able to breastfeed nearly as much. Third, they're ignoring the fact that not breastfeeding was actually implemented by like development projects from the US and the World Health, like all these health organizations internationally, like decades ago, following World War II, were telling people in the quote unquote third world not to breastfeed. Like that was the policy. Now we're trying to roll it all back and tell them to breastfeed now, but it's just ironic the fact that now we're saying, well, they're not breastfeeding because of their culture, but they were originally breastfeeding. We basically made them stop breastfeeding, and not to mention all of the challenges that they face every day to breastfeeding. So again, like culture becomes this way of justifying why people are different or not doing well.
So, I mean, the percentage that aren't breastfeeding, what alternative are they using?
I think they're just using like formula feeding.
Just formula? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But like you said, because a lot of those women are getting into the workforce.
A lot of them are, but a lot of them, like where I do research, a lot of women actually run out of breast milk. Like well before like even 1 year, and they're very knowledgeable about having to breast milk to at least 2 years, but a lot of the women I talked with in my research were like, no, I ran out of milk after a couple months, so I couldn't do that.
And those researchers didn't take that into account?
I don't think they did. I don't
know.
No, it's yeah, I don't know. I think
so for them it's just all culture.
Yeah, it's all culture and behavior. So that's the thing, like I think public health is interesting because it pulls from like biomedicine, but it does pull from psychology quite a bit, because a lot of their like health education curricula, a lot of them use like social cognitive theory. They cite Bandura like all the time. It's so funny. Yeah, like they pull a lot from psychology.
Yeah,
but only like certain theories. Like I don't think, like there's a medical psychology, or I think medical psychology, health psychology, and that's a whole other like realm of research that I think,
right,
because in the listserv in our anthro department we got an email of a syllabus of like health psychology. It seems interesting, and I don't know if I'm gonna take it, but there's just all this other new good stuff that's happening in psychology that I don't think public health is tapping into.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, there's a lot to think about there, and I'm curious too what the research, or what what's going on in these new fields, and that's a good point. But yeah. But what about these readings you gave me?
What stuck out to you? Because I'm sure you just...
Well, so I was reading the one on the I can't pronounce it, but the Brazilian tribe, or the natives.
The Candomblé.
Yeah, Candomblé.
Yeah, Candomblé.
I didn't get to finish it. I got maybe halfway through. But I think what stood out to me was just what the researcher was trying to, I guess, examine, with this, what did you call it? The psychophysiological, I guess, response of these mediums. What they feel when they become entranced by, I guess, what was it like? It wasn't demons, was it? Like some sort of just some spirit, right?
Yeah,
or some possession, right?
Yeah. Rebecca Seligman, the author.
Yeah. And so I think what stood out to me was I got to the point where they were talking about how, a lot of these mediums, they do report very similar physiological responses, and how certain people, only a certain few people can become mediums and others can't. And it's kind of I guess, is it learned? Is that something that they learn how to do?
Yeah.
But it's also, I don't know, maybe like something you're kind of born with. You're born with like this natural ability to like feel certain things, or like let go of your body and experience something fully. Like I don't.
Yeah, it's it's weird. I think all of it, nearly all of it, is learned, because from what I remember from her book was that a lot of it, a lot of the people who do become mediums actually experienced like a hard as fuck life. Like
Yeah,
they did,
yeah.
they went through
I
so
remember that.
much,
Yeah.
both emotionally, they had physical ailments, and it's like there's pivot where they now like see what they want to be and what they want to do through the religion, become a spirit medium and go that route, and that leads to this big profound transformation in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I guess it is interesting, because I guess some people can become it, some people can't.
Right.
So yeah, I guess where you draw the line, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you are born with it, but or you just haven't experienced enough hardship in your life, or
Yeah, yeah. I think that could very well be it. It it's interesting. It reminded me of I remember when I was younger. You know, like my mom would or my family would take me to like church services,
uh-huh.
and like I don't know if you ever witnessed, but like when people become like kind of possessed
Uh-huh.
by like the music or like the prayer, and then like you see some people like falling over or like fainting. And,
That happened at your church?
well, not like a. It was like random services that we would get invited to.
Yeah.
But
That reminds me of those where people are like speaking in tongues.
yeah, exactly. It was like that. Like we had some people. Yeah. There were some people that fell into that whole trance thing, and
Oh shit.
but it made me think like are these people like when I was in that moment, like I would think to myself like are these people for real? Like did they learn this?
Mm-hmm.
Like how do like am I wrong? Am I doing something wrong that I can't feel that?
Yeah.
Right? Or that I can't get into this trance?
Mm-hmm.
So it made me think of that.
Yeah.
And so I thought like, oh, maybe those people that can't become mediums, like, I don't know, is it something they're doing wrong? Or are they not like doing a certain thing, or not believing enough, or
Yeah.
right? But it's interesting to have read that, like the people that do become mediums, it's because, or at least they found that those are the people that have been through the most hardships and
Yeah.
or like the most trauma in their life. And but like what is it like, are they like transforming that energy or that something that's in them into becoming a medium? Like how does that work? Or why is it that hardship is leading them to be able to do what they do?
Yeah. I think it has to do with a similar it's similar to what like Russell Brand talks about in terms of addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Because like I don't know, there are of course like limitations and issues with going with any strategy for lessening or attending to addiction, like treatment. But he talks about this profound shift in himself, right? And I think that's pretty relevant to anybody going through anything. There has to be that profound shift, and exactly what's going to cause that shift is always a question. I think in this case it's religion, and I think that makes sense. Like it's this religious experience, people reorienting themselves and thinking of themselves in respect to religion and deities or spirits in different ways, that helps them make that shift. I guess it's just it's like what was interesting is that in her article she's talking about not only are these shifts like internal and personal and not only spiritual but also social,
Mm-hmm.
because you're socially a completely different person, because before you might have been, whatever, maybe a pariah, maybe no one wanted to mess with you, maybe you were super negative, maybe you were super sick all the time. But once you
Right.
become a medium, a lot of those people had a completely different social identity as well. So yeah, I think change just intersects with all those things. It's sort of hard to pin down, and that's maybe where individual differences come into play. Maybe some people are more motivated by the personal, maybe having the social matters to some people more than others, or maybe the spiritual is what some people really rely on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what about this?
Hmm.
Why do they keep finding that these mediums act in very similar ways, like very similar behaviors?
I think it's similar to what you said earlier when you were talking about culture, because culture, we all carry on these roles,
Mm-hmm.
and by having a different cultural and social role, a lot of these mediums ended up having a different concept of self. So I feel like this reminds me of theories of intersubjectivity, because those theories of intersubjectivity talk about how we are personal. We have like a personal self, and we have intentions, and we know what we want to do, and we act on what we think, right? But at the same time, we're also socially constituted. Like, we're constituted by interacting with one another. The fact that we do carry these social roles based on our gender or anything else, all that does speak to how we're being influenced profoundly by other people,
Right.
other people's expectations, maybe other people, what they've taught us. But either way, we're still people interacting with people and changing each other all the time. So I feel like it speaks to that power of how we're constantly being, we have influence on each other. And it's like that concept of, the 5 people closest to you, or the 5 people who are most going to influence you. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's sort of where it comes from, the fact that we are socially constituted as well as individually.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, but I know, like, these people, they get into this trance, and it's almost like these behaviors are just unconscious, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think I don't know if they mentioned, but when these people get in these trances, like they don't remember what they were doing, right?
Yeah, I don't think they did.
Right.
Or maybe they
But
said
just
they didn't. I don't know.
yeah, that's the thing. Like we don't. I guess we don't really know, but it's interesting to know that. They claim that they don't remember anything, but then it's like they all act in very similar ways. So it's just like this unconscious, like just learned behavior.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, it's interesting. Interesting to
yeah.
think about. Because, yeah, I mean, I'm sure you can self-induce memory
Mm-hmm.
and knowledge and maybe what you're not supposed to know. It's possible. Or maybe you did, but you're
Right.
like, no, I don't.
Uh huh. Uh huh. Right. It's kind of like what are those oh god, what are those people that they get you into, oh, the hypnotist, sorry. But I think I heard once that like a lot of people that fall into that sort of thing,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of like a similar thing, like it's almost like not everyone can be hypnotized, but certain people can.
Yeah.
It just, I guess, depends on the individual and like how susceptible they are to it, and
Yeah.
I feel like it's in a similar vein. Like,
Yeah. I think that's a good point. And it's not necessarily that some people are like mentally stronger than others. It just might be
right,
whatever the context of whatever it was that was said to you struck a chord and you were able to go with it.
right,
Yeah. Because
exactly.
I
Yeah.
think it would be a mistake to say, That would never happen to me. Never.
Uh-huh. Well, I would say that. Like, I can't get hypnotized. No, but I felt the same way when I would go to those church things and like,
Right.
I would see people cry and like faint and speak in tongues. I'm like, that would never happen to me. Like, what?
I mean, I felt the same way. I felt the same way.
Right.
But
I don't know.
we tend to be more critical of our own culture.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't know. Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Religion. How do you feel about religion now and looking back at all of those experiences?
Well, I think my perspectives changed a little bit, especially with Jordan Peterson and him talking, giving his Bible lecture, and it's made me think of religion in a different way. I think it's been more through like a psychological lens.
Yeah.
I mean, because obviously like Jordan Peterson is a psychologist, and that's like his perspective on the biblical stories. It's
Right.
like through a psychological lens. And I don't know, I have found what he has said about the stories to be, at least for me personally, like I see a lot of truth in it in terms of, I mean, because for him, like the stories are just about, just learning how to become a better person and like overcoming like the biggest hurdles
Right.
that we'll face in life. And for him, it's not so much that it's literal, it's just more of like, these stories teach you, I don't know, like how to overcome this, or like patience, or they have different moral
Right.
underpinnings. And
So how would you define, I guess, how would you explain his psychological lens? How would you say that informs his interpretation of the biblical stories? Because I think you're right. He does have clearly like a psychological orientation.
yeah.
Because how do you view it as a psychologist?
As a psychologist.
As a psychologist.
I mean, I know he talks a lot, and one of his biggest influencers is Carl Jung, but I think when he talks about like these stories and like the theorists that he looks up to the most, like there's a lot of overlay, and it's just more of like, he speaks about like the mental fortitude that you have to overcome the hardest things in life. And for him, it's like, like we're all gonna face challenges, and that's just like part of life. And if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's very individual oriented.
Yeah, it is. I feel like it is. And yeah.
I mean, that's how I would more or less view psychology. Because I feel like a big reason why I had gone into psychology in undergrad and why I even made it my minor was because I felt like a lot of it, I guess, helped me understand myself, build up a certain, I guess, resiliency, if you can say that. And I feel like a lot of it does, I guess, it can be empowering to learn about and understand, especially when you apply it to yourself. And I think that speaks to a lot of what psychology, I think, is mostly focused on. But at the same time, psychology is also focused on like broad trends. So it's focused on the individual, but it's also about how many individuals behave and are influenced by whatever variable or factor.
Yeah.
So it's like simultaneously individual oriented, yet focused on collecting all this data in order to, I guess, quantify how much an individual will likely behave in a certain context.
Right.
Do you feel like that's accurate?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it is. And I mean, yeah, it's very individual. And of course, like psychology it's created new fields as well, where it's trying to encompass more of like the community aspect and
Right.
just trying to broaden the spectrum a little bit. And yeah, like for example, like community psychology, I took a class on that one and for my master's, and that one was interesting. It reminds me a lot of anthropology because I felt like it was really big on trying to understand how the community at large is affecting the individual.
Yeah.
It starts from the community lens and then like kind of goes more, it narrows down to the individual.
Right.
So yeah, like how we form traditions, beliefs, what's the culture in a community like,
Right.
and how that affects the individual.
In anthropology, an anthropologist, Malinowski, that was his functional theory, was that the balance of society and like the functioning of culture and society ultimately was influencing and primarily based on having like the stability and functionality of the individual. Like it's interesting because there's like been anthropological theory that's very similar to that I think, again, like all theory does speak to a truth.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, I found that to be very eye-opening, and
Yeah.
it definitely made me see psychology in a new perspective. Because yeah, I mean, before that it was mainly about just the individual, and
Yeah.
but that was very much just talking about how like how we learn through society, the learned behaviors that we adopt, and
Yeah.
the roles that we take on, that sort of thing, kind of what we were talking about before.
Yeah.
So but yeah, and then I read the other, well, I didn't get to read too much of it, but the one on what was it called, Life Besides Itself or something? Or
Yeah, Life Beside Itself by Lisa Stevenson. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
I
a
only
good
got to
one.
read a few pages, but it looked really interesting. I want to finish it.
What is it on?
It was the one on the afterlife, and it started off with a story of a kid that like witnessed his best friend pass away, and then
Do you know what cultural group? Do you remember?
oh, I don't.
It was with the
But then
Inuit.
oh yeah, that's the one. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's in the Canadian Arctic.
Yeah, is that what the story is about specifically? Like, is it within that community, the Inuits?
It is. It's in the community of it's in Nunavut. It's
like north up there, right? Like northern Canada.
Yeah, it's pretty far north, or maybe mid center. I mean, once you get to the center, it's pretty far north. Yeah.
Right. And then so yeah, I was talking about how I guess like like what happens in the afterlife. Like, can we be so sure? Like, and then because I guess the boy gave the example of how he was talking to his sister, and then like they had an uncle that passed away, and then the uncle came or like was like reincarnated as a raven, and it was according to the sister, like the raven, the uncle was like in the backyard or something.
Yeah.
And like it never left, like it was just there.
Yeah. It's still there.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess the author was saying like, I guess she was kind of taking, was it a guy or a girl, the author? I can't remember.
Oh, a woman. Lisa.
Yeah, Lisa. But she was saying like how, I guess she was more of a neutral position. Like you can't say that what the girl was expressing or felt was either right or wrong.
Right.
To say like, oh no, that's bullshit. Like, there's no, your uncle is not reincarnated as a raven back there. Like,
she doesn't believe that.
Right, yeah. Right. So yeah, that was interesting. And then I kind of stopped after that. Like, I read a little bit in the it was going on about the Inuits and. But I don't know if you remember more of that reading.
Oh yeah, I love that book.
Yeah.
I read it all the way through. It was. Well, I
Well,
had to
what
read it
happened
for a class.
afterwards, or what happened as you keep reading?
So she switches between two different time periods.
Mm-hmm.
The first is in the 1950s with tuberculosis outbreak,
Oh yeah,
and then
I do remember that.
in the current suicide epidemic happening among the Inuit or the Inuit. Yeah.
Right, because they would take the person that was infected, like they would, I guess, fly them to the nearest clinic or hospital, right? And then,
yeah,
like they wouldn't make it most of the time, right?
Yeah. So
like they would just pass away.
That was a big thing in the 1950s. A lot of people never saw their families ever again. Like they just took them away, and they never found out what was happened to them because some of them didn't speak the language other than their native language, and
right.
A lot of the times there was no identification, so they didn't really even have a name, the Canadian health officials. So that she was talking about how the government and bureaucracies implement care. So what does it mean to care for a person? Because that was the Canadian government's version of caring. Just like right now, the way that we conceive of care among such high rates of suicide is by implementing and saying for people to call the, suicide hotline. I mean, like that Logic song, like that's such a big thing, like call because we care. But her point is that in both examples, what it means to care is very impersonal. Like it's not caring for me because I'm the person that I am. It's more like you're a human being, you should be cared for, and that's it. Right. So kind of asking, is that really the best kind of care that we can give one another? Yeah.
Did she suggest any I guess better approach for caring?
I think it was more understanding how people view the world. So this is such a good book for a few reasons. So going back to our discussion of culture, I think this book's author is really good about broadening what it means for people to believe differently and believe in different things. Because what anthropology's moved more towards beyond culture is this notion of ontologies. So ontologies is much deeper than culture because ontology speaks to the fact that people view like reality and nature functioning fundamentally in a different way. Like it's not just the fact that people believe something, because culture implies that there's an objective reality that's going to be nature and it's going to be stable regardless of a culture you believe in. And our culture is on top of that. But ontology says that no, basically our understanding of the whole world is different. And I think in this, what she's saying is that in Inuit ontology is the fact that there's no real clear boundary between life and death. And that's sort of the main, I think, argument of her book. And I think she jumps from there into all these really interesting theories. But because that line is not so clear, when Canadian bureaucracy comes in to implement care, it ends up being received as violent. So the fact that people take family members away and the family members never ever come back and they never ever hear from them again is considered violent. And in today's suicide epidemic, the fact that there's like, yes, you should call the suicide hotline because we care for you and you should be cared for as a human being. At the same time, it's still very impersonal. So it's again seen as kind of cold and violent because I think overall, I think the reason why it really sunk in with me is because having grown up with my mom in the medical field, the medical field is fairly impersonal. It's so cold.
Yeah.
I mean, go to a
Definitely.
hospital, you're gonna find people who, I mean, the culture of a hospital is to learn to not let shit like affect your emotions. Like you learn to
Mm-hmm.
compartmentalize and to shut it off if you work in a hospital.
Right.
And
Right.
how does that translate to people who come to receive care? So I think she's touched on something important that I think may even translate to, because I mean, what's the group that's experiencing the most suicide in the US? I mean, it's white males.
Right.
And I think that speaks to the fact that it's much broader than just saying this culture is going through a hard time. I think it's much more generalizable than that. And everyone's kind of going through this tough time because of a lot of factors. And I think impersonal care is one factor that was really interesting.
Yeah. No, that's really. Yeah, it was interesting to read that, and yeah, it makes you think of, you know, the culture we live in right now, and the times that we're in, and like how can we make things more personal. And I mean, I think you're right. Like, yeah, when you go to hospitals, like it does feel cold
Mm-hmm.
and distant, and I'm sure people that go there don't feel like they're truly cared for, or they feel connected.
Mm-mm.
So yeah, it makes you think of that, and that's a good point.
Yeah.
And then, so how do we come up with better approaches, and or a better health model, or
Yeah.
you know?
No, I agree. That's I think the main thing anthropology as a discipline needs to do a better job of actually, like, it's one thing to criticize because it's easy to criticize. And we need to criticize.
Yeah.
Like we
Mm-hmm.
need to understand what's lacking in order to find out we can do better.
Yeah, in order to enact change, right?
Exactly.
That's how we start. Mm-hmm.
So it's always, yeah, a great start, but sort of going that extra step. And that's why I think it's important for like anthropology and like academia and psychology to step more outside of the university and to, I don't know, be more public.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I didn't get to the last reading, or the third reading, but
No, it's okay.
if you give me a brief summary, if you remember it.
What was the third reading?
Oh God, I don't remember.
I don't remember. Yeah, it's okay.
It's okay.
But
All
how do you see psychology looking at some, okay, how do you think psychology looks at, I guess, the body and
Body.
yeah, because a lot of those readings touch on, like, I guess, embodiment, kind of in the video that we put out.
Yeah.
And I guess, how do you think psychology like views the body? And because I know psychology plays with embodiment too, which does blur the line between like the body and the mind.
Right.
But how did you like learn about it in your program, or how do you look at psychology viewing that?
Yeah, let me think. I mean, apart just from learning about certain, psychiatric disorders,
Yeah.
and just the physical symptoms that come with that, I mean, it's interesting. I think it was the first reading that also talked about. It gave the example of like schizophrenics, right, and how we tend to see very like similar behavioral patterns that emerge, at least from like the body,
Right.
like if they have a certain, I don't know, a certain movement or a certain, it's, and then it goes into like the somatic, the psychosomatic, I guess, symptoms that people feel. But I'm trying to think of like what. It's weird. I feel like we didn't talk so much about the body. I mean, like we talked about drugs and how they affect the body, the physical symptoms. But other than that, I can't say too much, man. Like,
yeah.
But again, like going back to that schizophrenic example, like it's funny. I mean, not funny, but like it's interesting to see how, yeah, there's like a similar pattern. So it's almost like are these learned behaviors from society, or is it just like, you know, the brain chemistry that like switches on a certain physiological response, right?
Right.
So. I wish I could give you more.
No,
But I feel like we didn't talk so much about the body and. At least not from the classes. You know, if anything, you know, from the little that I've read on my own about like exercising and how that affects our mental well-being and.
Right.
I mean, other than that, like, I'm not sure, man.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
No, I think it speaks to how different departments are going to cover different material, because there's so much literature out there.
There is.
I mean, your department was more clinical. So what does that?
Yeah.
What do you think that translated into in terms of what kind of coursework?
More of the psychiatric disorders, how that affects. I mean, the body, like I talked about, like the symptoms you have, and just kind of like learning how to diagnose certain things, learning how to treat certain things.
Yeah.
And more of just the diagnostics behind it.
Yeah.
Behind therapy and behind diagnosing. So.
Right.
That was what my coursework was mainly focused on.
And like learning how different medications affected the body.
Exactly.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, I remember
how certain drugs affect the body. And
right.
Yeah. Or maybe, I don't know if you can maybe rephrase your question to see if I can better understand it. Or what have you thought about that from your own perspective?
I think, I know for anthropology, there's this divide between applied versus theoretical.
Mm-hmm.
So my program here, USF, is applied.
Right.
And different programs tend to be more theoretical. Like Berkeley, for example, in terms of medical anthropology, tends to be more theoretical than it is applied. At least, like, those were the two that I was thinking about when I applied for programs.
Yeah.
And I think what that means is, in terms of theory, for a place like Berkeley, where you're more likely to encounter more theory and to engage with theory, it's going to come off a lot more like a philosophy program, where you're having to think really deeply about certain, epistemologies and really engage with phenomenology in terms of how research and theory are playing with one another. But in an applied program, it tends to be much more grounded in, I think, the material world. And I think generally what that translates into is doing something with anthropology. So I'm getting probably significantly less theory from this program than I would from a different program, but I'm also getting much more applied experience, actual research experience constantly.
Yeah.
And So it's
More
sort of,
hands-on.
yeah, so it's a trade-off in some ways.
Yeah. Right.
But I'm also seeking out those theories for myself in some ways, but also selecting professors that I think will help me engage more with theory in general.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it's that much of a difference, because what I'm saying right now, I knew it when I was applying, but when I spoke to each program, people were like, no, we do both. Like I called Berkeley, and the professors there was like, no, we do a lot of applied in theory. Like, we're very balanced. And I think they said something similar here. And I was like, bullshit. It's you can't do it all. You can't do it all. That's not how it works. So, I mean, it sucks that it doesn't work that way, but you kind of have to know what you're in for.
Right. But I feel like, I feel probably most programs would say that, right? They're not going to say like, oh yeah, it's just theory here.
Yeah, what are they supposed to say?
I mean, because it makes sense that you would say both, right? Because you want to learn the theory and then you want to learn how to apply it, right? And then
maybe I was a jerk for asking, trying to test them, see what they said.
Right. No, but I feel like my program was very similar too. I think, I feel like mine had a good amount of theory, and then like we would practice it, and practice it within the boundaries of a classroom, but I feel like yours is probably more like in the outside world, like outside of the university, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to ours, mine, like, it wasn't that way so much. Maybe we had one project here and there that we would have to actually like go out of the university to, go do an interview with someone or with the community, but.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that is. Yeah, you gotta have both. I think it's pretty obvious that you need both, and so.
You need both, but you don't always get it, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I probably didn't get enough of the applied part.
No.
Yeah. It was probably more and more of the theory and more of like a philosophy kind of approach.
Yeah.
But it is what it is, man. It's over.
It's over. It's been over. How long?
It's been over.
How long ago did you graduate?
That was 2000. Well, the last course I took. Gosh, because remember I was doing the MFT, like extension with it, so. Oh God, I think it was like 2017.
Yeah.
That I took my last course.
Only 2 years ago.
Only 2 years ago. But that was like one course. It was like nothing at that point. I was pretty much done.
Yeah.
But yeah, man.
What I always think it's interesting to think about, like, grad school.
Yeah.
What would you have told yourself? What would you have liked to have learned before going into the program that you knew at the end?
At least for my program specifically, like, I would have loved to know what the whole process of becoming a therapist entails. Because unfortunately, like, a lot of, at least to me, the most important things, like, I didn't learn until like I was pretty much done. Like, so for example, how many hours of postmasters I have to do so I can be eligible to sit down for my licensing exam. So like I have to find like a placement site, and I have to pretty much work at doing therapy with clients.
Yeah.
And how many hours that entails. And like if it weren't for the MFT courses I took, because those helped me a lot too. If it weren't for that, like, I would have had no idea. If I would have just done the clinical psych program, and just left within, within, if I would have finished within the 2 years, I would have been lost, man. It's just, there's so much more that goes into it, into becoming a therapist afterwards, that I feel like a lot of those grad students just do not know about.
Yeah.
Well, at least in my program, I don't. Maybe other programs are better at explaining things, but we're being just clear about the objectives, I guess, that you have to reach. So,
what kind of stuff did you learn in the MFT that you didn't get in the regular program, or the main program?
Well, the MFT was much more. I think I feel like the MFT was much more applied.
Yeah.
I feel like it was more hands-on. Because we would actually like practice like certain approaches or certain techniques of therapy.
Yeah.
It was much more focused on the therapeutic process.
Yeah.
So like, how do you greet your clients? Okay, you have to come up with a God, what is that called?
Protocol.
Like the form they give you, like you have to fill it out, like when consent. You go to like a consent form, and or like negotiating like your price for the client, like how much you're going to charge, what their goals are,
like a high end. Never mind.
Like a what?
Never. I was gonna say like a high end. And I stopped.
Exactly.
I don't want to finish that.
Yep. Something like that.
Self-censoring.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just much more like the logistics behind therapy that I didn't learn in just the clinical psych program by itself.
Yeah.
And then yeah, it was just much more hands-on, and like we did learn some theory as well, but yeah, much more hands-on. It was, yeah, I think that's the most, I think those were the important distinctions that I could remember.
Right.
And but yeah, those are all things I wish I would have learned on early on, and it's just a very long process, and I didn't realize that until the end. Hence why, like, at least for now, like, I'm not gonna continue with becoming a therapist.
Yeah, and what about? Yeah, because I remember before that you had expressed interest in wanting to go to a PhD program. And do you feel like you'll ever want to go into one?
Honestly, right now, no.
No.
I feel like, at least with schooling, like I'm pretty much done with.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm much more dedicated to focusing on something like our channel here.
Yeah.
And
in the restaurant.
That's where in the restaurant. That's where my time and my interest lies in right now.
Yeah.
So.
No, I mean, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
That you can
it's just, yeah, I've just, like speaking, like I just met up with some friends from my cohort.
Yeah.
And one in particular, like he's doing his PhD, and I guess he talks to me a lot about his struggles and
not having a good time.
He is and he isn't. I mean, no, I think he is for the most part. Like he's always enjoyed school and learning, but
is that the one that went to Alaska?
Yeah, yeah, in Fairbanks. But it's just, I think it's just the whole commitment thing that just really does not fly with me, man. It's
you're scared. You're afraid of commitment, bro.
Yeah, man. Or at least that commitment. I feel like it's really something you really want.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you got to be in it 100.
Mm-hmm.
100%.
Well, definitely can't be wishy-washy.
Yeah, and I feel like that would be me if I were to go into one. Like, I just feel like my heart wouldn't be in it.
Yeah.
So, I'd rather just not do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. If you know, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's, psychology is one of those disciplines where a lot of people are gonna apply to your programs.
A lot. Yeah, it's very competitive.
And I was talking with someone else in the program about this, about anthropology, because compared to psychology, anthropology is a lot smaller.
Yeah.
And I was telling him, like, I wonder if that means anthropology is necessarily like easier to get into. And he disagreed and said that no, it means that anthropology departments tend to be smaller. They accept less students. So at the end,
Right.
the proportions might be very similar.
Mm-hmm.
Where anthro departments will accept less students because they tend to be a lot smaller. So it may end up evening out.
Right.
But I think across the board, for a lot of grad students, what a lot of grad students don't do is actually like get to know their professors before they apply, or even in the application process. Like, I know for you had started volunteering, you had started talking to professors before you, or while you were applying, or before you applied in that year before you entered the program. And I think a lot of people don't even do that.
Oh, no.
A lot of people don't do that. And I was thinking about this the other day, because what goes in an application for a grad program? It's the GRE, the statement of purpose or letter of intent, whatever they call it.
Right.
Your GPAs, because you need your transcripts, and letters of recommendation.
Right.
Your GRE scores, depending on what it is, people won't really care about it. I know in anthropology they don't care. Like, a lot of programs need it, but I think they look at it with less weight compared to the other things.
Yeah, I found that to be true also.
Yeah.
For at least the psych programs that I heard about.
Yeah. Because isn't there a psychology specific GRE?
There is, yeah.
Huh.
And some programs do require that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next is so there's a GRE. So your grades. So your transcripts.
Right.
I mean, I think generally programs want you to be within a range. And once you hit a range, I don't know, like, I don't necessarily think having a 4.0 is going to like necessarily, clinch the program for you.
No, I don't think so.
A lot of people assume it will, but it's so funny how grades at a certain level just stop mattering. They don't matter anymore.
Well, yeah. I think for a grad program, like, I mean, everyone there has to do well.
Yeah.
It's like, everyone's going to have good GPAs.
Yeah. You get kicked out.
You get kicked out. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
That's just... So it's like, yeah, I don't think grades matter all that much.
You get no points
because
for grades.
everyone's like on the same level.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Maybe a little, maybe one class, like, oh, I got a B or something.
Yeah.
But... yeah, most of the students are on it at that level anyways.
Yeah.
The grad level, so
it's expected.
I don't think that. Right. I think what matters much more is, what you're saying, your connections with professors, your relationships with them.
Yeah.
Your research experience.
Yeah.
I think working in a lab, in a research lab is much more important than your grades.
Yeah, I agree.
At least that's what the professors that I talk to would tell me. If you can get in with a good professor and you really do a lot of good work, with their research, that'll take you much, much further than anything else.
And ironically, I think that alone will help you both with getting good letters of recommendation. Exactly. And being able to write a good statement of purpose. Like, if you then execute those well, then that'll be great. But
right.
It's just so funny because I feel like a lot of people are concerned with getting good grades and getting a good GRE score. that they think that the more competitive it gets, that the more those things matter, almost like the more merit matters. But I think the more competitive it gets, the less merit matters. I mean, yes, you are expected to do well on certain things, but it's really like you have to fall within a certain range, and as long as you're with it, they'll look at your application.
Right, exactly.
From there, it's important to establish those personal connections and actually reach out and talk to them, because people don't talk to professors at universities. Their phones aren't ringing off the hook.
Right. No.
Yeah.
I mean, I witnessed that with myself and with a lot of undergrad friends that I had as well.
Yeah.
Like, we just didn't have the research experience. We didn't have those connections. It was just like, yeah, just the GPA and
yeah,
your GRE, and that's about it. And kind of hope that one of the programs takes you like that way. But yeah, no, that what really matters is, yeah, the connections and the work outside the classroom that you put in.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's so ironic.
Sure.
It's so ironic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's because, like, I think of professors. Professors are doing really cool shit.
Oh yeah,
it's
there's
like
a lot of them.
They're celebrities without the notoriety. They're celebrities without the celebrity. And no one ever talks to them or contacts them. But there's so many people doing such cool stuff, and who acquire a lot of prestige within their discipline. But that's like the fact that they don't have their phones ringing off the hook by these prospective grad students. I think that really means things are in your favor if you want to go to grad school. You just have to call them and talk to them, because everything's online. Email them. Oh, they didn't respond. Easy. Call them.
Yeah, just keep trying and really put in the effort to connect.
Yeah.
It could take you a long way. You never know. Yeah. You never know.
True.
Yeah.